In the year 218 AD, a 14-year-old boy became the most powerful man in the known world. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but history would remember him by a nickname derived from the Syrian sun god he worshipped, Elagabalus. But this wasn't just any teenage emperor. What Elagabalus would do during his 4 years of rule would shock even the most decadent Romans. And yes, the title isn't clickbait. This emperor literally sold his body while sitting on the imperial throne. Before we get to the scandalous part, you need to understand how a Syrian teenager ended up ruling Rome. Elagabalus was born in 204 AD in Emesa, modern-day Syria. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, was the sister-in-law of Emperor Septimius Severus. When Emperor Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD, his Praetorian prefect Macrinus seized power. But Julia Maesa had other plans. She spread rumors that her grandson was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son. The Eastern legions, who had loved Caracalla, believed it. They looked at this beautiful boy with his long golden hair and saw their dead emperor reborn. The boy himself was already something special in Emesa. As the hereditary high priest of Elagabal, he would dance before the altar at dawn, wearing magnificent silk robes that shimmered in the morning light. Local nobles would gather to watch this ethereal child perform the sacred rituals, his movements graceful and hypnotic. When Julia Maesa presented him to the legions, she knew exactly what she was doing. She dressed him in purple, the imperial color, and had him stand before the soldiers at sunrise, his golden hair catching the light like a halo. The effect was magical. The hardened soldiers fell to their knees, seeing not just a boy, but a divine figure. On May 16, 218 AD, the 14-year-old was proclaimed emperor. Macrinus, who was in Antioch at the time, initially dismissed the threat. How could a child challenge him? But as more legions defected to Elagabalus, Macrinus realized the danger. The two armies met at the Battle of Antioch on June 8, 218 AD. It should have been a massacre. Macrinus had experienced troops and seasoned commanders. But something extraordinary happened. In the middle of the battle, when his forces began to waver, the teenage Elagabalus leaped from his horse and ran to the front lines. Dressed in his purple cloak, the boy grabbed the eagle standard of the legion and charged forward, screaming prayers to his sun god. The sight of this child emperor leading the charge inspired his troops and terrified the enemy. Macrinus's forces broke and ran. The emperor himself fled the battlefield, only to be caught and killed days later. At just 14 years old, Elagabalus had won the Roman Empire in personal combat. The journey from Syria to Rome took almost a year. Along the way, Elagabalus stopped at Nicomedia for the winter, and it was here that the Roman Senate got their first disturbing reports about their new emperor. Instead of studying statecraft or military strategy, the teenage emperor spent his days performing elaborate religious ceremonies. He would wake before dawn to greet the sun with dancing and chanting. He insisted on personally sacrificing hundreds of cattle and sheep, covering himself in blood as he performed the rituals. More disturbing to Roman sensibilities, he had begun experimenting with his appearance. He removed all body hair, used cosmetics to enhance his already beautiful features, and wore silk garments that clung to his body in ways that Romans considered effeminate and inappropriate. When Elagabalus finally entered Rome in September 219 AD, the senators expected a puppet they could control. What they got was something far more disturbing. The new emperor arrived in a chariot pulled by 4 white horses. But he was facing backward, gazing at a massive black meteorite that followed in another chariot. This wasn't just any stone. Elagabalus claimed it was the physical manifestation of Elagabal, fallen from heaven. The procession stopped at every temple along the route, where Elagabalus would perform Syrian dances, while Romans watched in stunned silence. His appearance shocked them even more. The emperor wore silk robes of purple and gold, his eyes lined with kohl, his cheeks painted with rouge, and jewels adorning every finger. His hair, dyed golden blonde, was arranged in the Syrian style with a diadem that caught the light. To Romans, who valued masculine austerity, their new emperor looked more like an Eastern courtesan than a military commander. Elagabalus immediately set about transforming Rome itself. He didn't just build a temple for his god. He constructed the Elagabalus, a massive complex on the Palatine Hill that dwarfed many existing temples. The black stone was installed with great ceremony, and Elagabalus declared that all other gods were now subordinate to Elgabal. But he went further. He had the sacred fire of Vesta moved to his temple. He took the holiest relics of Rome, the shields of Mars, the stone of Cybele, and placed them before his meteorite. He even claimed that Jews and Christians should worship in his temple, as their gods were merely aspects of Elagabal. Every morning, instead of attending to state business, the emperor would perform his rituals. These weren't simple prayers. Elagabalus would dance for hours, whirling in circles until he reached a state of ecstasy. He would sacrifice hundreds of animals, pouring wine and precious perfumes over the altars until the temple floors were slippery with blood and oil. He insisted that the entire Senate attend these ceremonies. Imagine the most powerful men in Rome forced to watch their teenage emperor writhe in religious ecstasy, covered in animal blood, screaming prayers in Aramaic to a black stone. Now here's where things get truly bizarre. According to the historian Cassius Dio, who lived during Elagabalus's reign, the emperor transformed parts of the imperial palace into something that scandalized even the most libertine Romans. It started gradually. Elagabalus would dress in women's clothing, not just any clothing, but the outfit of a common prostitute. He would wear short tunics that barely covered his thighs, paint his face with white lead and rouge, and adorn himself with cheap jewelry. But this was just the beginning. He had a room in the palace, specially decorated with silk curtains and soft cushions. He would stand in the doorway, calling out to passers-by in the corridor, senators, generals, foreign ambassadors, using the exact phrases that street prostitutes used. "Come inside, darling," he would purr. "I'm fresh and ready for you." But here's the twist that makes it even more surreal. He was still the emperor. These weren't role-play games in private. This was the ruler of the known world, in the imperial palace, actively soliciting anyone who walked by. The Roman writer Herodian reports that Elagabalus would actually demand payment for his services. He had a servant whose only job was to collect fees and keep accounts. The emperor of Rome, the man who controlled the world's greatest empire, was literally charging fees for intimate encounters while wearing the imperial purple. One senator, who left a written account, described being summoned for an important state meeting, only to find the emperor in a see-through silk gown beckoning him into the bedchamber. When the senator tried to discuss taxation policy, Elagabalus supposedly replied, "That will cost extra, darling." But the palace wasn't enough for Elagabalus. He had a network of slaves whose job was to scout the city's brothels and taverns for interesting characters. When they found someone noteworthy, usually for their physical attributes, they would invite them to the palace. Historical accounts describe how he would sneak out at night, wearing a wig to disguise himself, and work in taverns and brothels throughout Rome. Not as a customer, as an employee. He would take a cheap blonde wig, dress in the clothing of a common prostitute, and stand in the doorways of the seediest establishments in the Subura district. The Augustan history, though often exaggerated, provides specific details. Elagabalus would rent a room above a tavern near the Forum. He would hang a sign outside with prices listed. Regular Romans, not knowing they were with the emperor, would pay their copper coins and spend time with what they thought was just another working girl. His guards would follow at a distance, terrified that their emperor would be recognized and killed. But Elagabalus seemed to thrive on the danger. He would return to the palace at dawn, bruised and exhausted, coins jingling in his purse, and immediately attend Senate meetings still wearing his prostitute's makeup. Among all his relationships, one stood out above the rest. Heracles was a slave from Caria, a chariot driver in the Circus Maximus. During a race, he fell from his chariot directly in front of the imperial box. His helmet came off, revealing golden hair and a beautiful face. Elagabalus was instantly smitten. The emperor not only freed Heracles, but elevated him to unprecedented heights. Ancient sources claim that Elagabalus referred to himself as Heracles' wife and demanded to be called mistress and queen by his lover. He would appear in public with bruises, proudly telling anyone who asked that his husband had disciplined him for being naughty. The relationship went beyond mere scandal. Elagabalus allegedly offered half the empire's treasury to any physician who could perform surgery to give him female genitalia. He consulted doctors from across the empire, describing in detail how he wanted to be transformed so he could bear Hierocles' children. When one Egyptian physician claimed he could perform such an operation, Elagabalus prepared for the surgery by fasting and praying. Only the intervention of his grandmother, who threatened to have the doctor executed, prevented the procedure. Elagabalus's parties became legendary for their excess. The rose petal incident remains one of the most infamous. During a summer banquet, he had tons of rose petals suspended in nets above the dining couches. As the evening progressed, slaves gradually released the petals. At first, guests were delighted as fragrant petals drifted down like pink snow. But the petals kept coming, and coming. Soon they were ankle-deep, then knee-deep. Guests tried to stand but slipped on the silky mass. The petals reached waist-height, then chest-height. Several elderly senators actually suffocated, drowning in flowers, while Elagabalus laughed from his elevated platform. When slaves finally cleared the room, they found 3 dead bodies buried under the roses. Elagabalus ordered them thrown into the Tiber, saying they should be honored to die so beautifully. His regular dinners were equally outrageous. He would serve his guests food based on the color of the day. If he declared it a blue day, everything had to be blue. Peacock brains dyed with woad, fish colored with lapis lazuli, bread tinted with copper sulfate that made diners violently ill. Another time, he served his guests food made of glass, wax, and marble that looked exactly like real dishes. While they pretended to eat these inedible replicas, he gorged himself on real delicacies, laughing at their discomfort. One senator broke 3 teeth trying to bite into a marble apple, afraid to offend the emperor by not eating. He would also play pranks like releasing leopards and lions into dining rooms, supposedly tame ones, but imagine the terror, or tying his dinner guests to water wheels and watching them spin around until they vomited. He once locked his guests in the dining room overnight with several tame lions. Though the beasts were allegedly well-fed and docile, one senator died of a heart attack from fear. Perhaps his cruelest innovation was his twisted lottery system. During public festivals, Elagabalus would distribute lottery tickets to the crowd. The tickets looked identical, sealed with the Imperial seal. Some would win incredible prizes: houses, gold, slaves, appointments to lucrative positions. Others would win prizes like dead dogs, swarms of bees, or orders for their own execution. One man opened his ticket to find he'd won 10 pounds of flies. Another received 1,000 pounds of spider webs. A woman won immediate strangulation. The crowds never knew whether to cheer or flee when the emperor appeared with his lottery urns. He would stand on the palace balcony, tossing tickets into the crowd, laughing as people fought over them, not knowing if they were fighting for wealth or death. One particularly cruel lottery included tickets for becoming a senator for a day, mixed with tickets for being sewn into a leather sack with wild animals. The terror on people's faces as they opened their prizes sent Elagabalus into fits of ecstatic laughter. Elagabalus's personal life was equally chaotic. His first marriage was to Julia Cornelia Paula, from an aristocratic Roman family. The wedding was magnificent, with the emperor giving every soldier a bonus and every citizen of Rome a feast. But after just a few months, he divorced her, claiming she had a blemish on her body that made her unsuitable. His second marriage caused a religious crisis. He married Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. The Vestal virgins were sacred priestesses who tended Rome's eternal flame. They took 30-year vows of chastity, and violating a Vestal was punishable by death for both parties. The man would be beaten to death, the Vestal buried alive. Elagabalus didn't care. He claimed their union would produce godlike children from the joining of the sun god's priest with Vesta's priestess. He had coins minted showing them together, advertising his sacrilege to the entire empire. When the marriage produced no children and massive public outrage, he divorced her. His third marriage was to Annia Faustina, a descendant of Marcus Aurelius. This lasted 5 months before he divorced her and remarried the Vestal Virgin, claiming he'd made a mistake. He then divorced the Vestal again and married a 5th time, all while maintaining his relationship with Heracles. Beyond his personal scandals, Elagabalus attempted a complete religious revolution in Rome. He didn't just want his god worshipped, he wanted Elagabal to absorb all other deities. He performed a sacred marriage ceremony between his meteorite and the statue of Minerva, then changed his mind and married the stone to Urania, a Carthaginian moon goddess. He forced the Senate to participate in his ceremonies. Picture Rome's most dignified elders, men who had commanded legions and governed provinces, forced to wear Syrian robes and dance around a black rock, while cymbals crashed and drums pounded. He introduced sacred prostitution to Rome, installing temple prostitutes in the Elagabalus. Both men and women served the god with their bodies, with the fees going to temple maintenance. Roman matrons were horrified to see their daughters volunteering for temple service, inspired by their emperor's example. By 221 AD, even Elagabalus's own grandmother Julia Maesa realized her grandson had to go. The Praetorian Guard was on the verge of revolt. They had suffered 3 years of humiliation, forced to participate in Syrian rituals, watching their emperor prostitute himself, seeing the traditions of Rome mocked daily. The Senate despised him not just for his behavior, but for his complete neglect of governance. While Rome's frontiers were threatened and the economy struggled, their emperor spent his days dancing before his stone and his nights working in brothels. Julia Maesa convinced Elagabalus to adopt his cousin Alexander as his heir. She told him this would free him to focus on his religious duties. But when Elagabalus realized this was a plot to replace him, he flew into a rage. Elagabalus tried multiple times to kill his cousin. He invited Alexander to dinner and attempted to poison him, but a slave warned the boy. He tried to have him stabbed during a sacrifice, but the assassins lost their nerve. Finally, he ordered the Praetorian Guard to execute Alexander. This was the final straw. The guard had tolerated the embarrassment, the religious reforms, even the sexual scandals. But they wouldn't kill an innocent Roman boy to preserve this Syrian madman's power. On March 11, 222 AD, Elagabalus sensed danger. He tried to flee the palace with his mother and Heracles, but found the gates blocked by guardsmen. He attempted to hide in a chest, but was discovered. Finally, he and his mother took refuge in a latrine, a public toilet, in the Praetorian camp. The guards found them cowering among the filth. What happened next was brutal, even by Roman standards. The 18-year-old emperor was dragged out, begging for mercy, still wearing the silk robes he'd put on that morning. His mother tried to shield him with her body, but the guards cut her down first. Elagabalus died badly. The guards didn't give him a clean death. They beat him, stabbed him repeatedly, and then began the real humiliation. His body was stripped naked and dragged through the streets on hooks. The Roman mob, who had suffered 4 years of his rule, kicked and spat on the corpse. But the humiliation didn't end there. They dragged the body to the Emilian Bridge, where they discovered it was too large to fit through the drain holes. So they cut off his genitals, a final mockery of his sexual behavior, and then forced the mutilated corpse through. The body was thrown into the Tiber River, but not before the mob had tied weights to it to ensure it would sink and never receive proper burial. It was the ultimate insult in Roman culture, denying him any hope of an afterlife. Within hours of his death, the Senate met in emergency session. They passed a damnatio memoriae, an order to destroy all images and inscriptions bearing his name. Statues were smashed, coins were melted down, his name was chiseled off monuments. The Elagabalus was destroyed, the black stone sent back to Syria. The Vestal flame was returned to its proper temple. Every trace of his religious reforms was erased. His marriages were declared invalid, his adoptions revoked, his edicts cancelled. Even his birth name, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, was forbidden, as it connected him to the revered Antonine dynasty. He would be known only as Elagabalus, the false Antoninus, the Syrian pretender. Now here's something important to consider. How much of this is actually true? Most of our sources about Elagabalus were written by his enemies after his death. The senators hated him for disrupting their power. Traditional Romans despised his Eastern customs. His successor, Alexander Severus, had every reason to blacken his predecessor's name. Modern historians debate whether Elagabalus was truly as depraved as the sources claim, or if he was simply a teenager thrust into absolute power who embraced a different culture and perhaps had different sexual preferences than the Roman norm. Some scholars suggest he might have been transgender, noting his desire for gender reassignment surgery, his preference for female pronouns, and his adoption of feminine roles. Others argue he was simply playing with gender expectations as part of his religious duties. What we do know for certain is that he was killed at 18. His religious reforms were immediately reversed, and the Roman establishment tried to erase his memory entirely. Whether every scandalous story is true or not, Elagabalus remains one of history's most fascinating figures. He represents the absolute corruption of absolute power, a teenager given control of the world who used it to indulge every whim, no matter how shocking. His name became synonymous with excess, depravity, and the dangers of unchecked authority. Even in a culture that had seen Caligula and Nero, Elagabalus managed to shock and appall. The boy who sold his body while wearing the imperial purple, who turned the palace into a brothel, who suffocated guests with rose petals. He ruled for just 4 years, but left a legacy that has fascinated and horrified for nearly 2,000 years. And perhaps that's the most Roman thing about him. Even in disgrace and death, Elagabalus achieved the immortality that every emperor craved, just not in the way he might have hoped.